In the preceding talk, we looked at the very important part of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's speech in the Constituent Assembly when the Constitution was presented to the Constituent Assembly. And we have seen various aspects of this speech in which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has commented on various aspects of the Constitution. And we have seen various aspects of our Constitution. So basically he raised two important questions: form of the government and form of the Constitution. And then he went on discussing these two important questions, suggesting what form of Constitution Indian state is going to adopt and what form of government the Indian state is going to adopt. And then, after having discussed the nature of the government and the nature of the Constitution, he talked about very important concept of or a proposal for Indian Federation and what difference, how it differs from the other federal states. So I will repeat, federalism is described as a weak, if not effete, form of government. There are two weaknesses from which a federation is alleged to suffer. One is rigidity and other is legalism. Federal constitution cannot but be a written constitution, and a written constitution must necessarily be a rigid constitution, because federalism comes into existence because of the written constitution. The written constitution must necessarily be a rigid constitution. A federal constitution means division of sovereignty by no less a sanction than that of the law of the constitution between the federal government and state, with two necessary consequences: that any invasion by the federal government in the field assigned to the states and vice versa is a breach of the constitution, and such breach is justiciable matter to be determined by the judiciary alone. This being the nature of federalism, federal constitution cannot escape the charge of legalism. Because if there is a federal constitution, there will be always some or other kind of discontentment between the federal unit and the unitary or the union. And because such kind of tussle is going to take place between the state and the central government, there has to be a court of law which will look into the quarrel between the states and the central. And therefore, the federal constitution cannot escape the charge of legalism. There will be so much of legal matters or aspects, and therefore it can't escape. These faults of a federal constitution have been found in a pronounced form in the Constitution of the United States, because we have seen that the United States has come into being because of various colonies agreeing to form a federal states, and they are the indestructible units of the United States. As far as Indian states are concerned, they can be changed, their boundaries can be altered, their names can be changed. On the other hand, the American states, they are going to remain as they are. They can't be changed. They are the indestructible units. Not only that, but because they have their separate constitutions, and because the central government has its own constitution, there is always a kind of a tussle between the two constitutions. The countries which have adopted federalism as a latter date have attempted to reduce the disadvantages following from the rigidity and legalism which are inherent therein. The example of Australia may well be referred to in this matter. The Australian Constitution has adopted the following means to make its federation less rigid. And basically these two means that the Australian Constitution has adopted. Number one, by conferring upon the Parliament of the Commonwealth large powers of concurrent legislation and few powers of exclusive legislation, by making some of the articles of the Constitution of a temporary duration to remain in force only until Parliament otherwise provides. So basically in our Constitution there are three kinds of lists: the Union list, and the jurisdiction or the power to make laws on of the subjects which fall in that Union list lies exclusively in the hands of the Union government. And then there is a state list, under which the states have power to make laws on the subjects which are under the state list. And then there is third list, which is called the concurrent list, in which both the union and the state governments can make laws. So Union list confers the power to make laws on the subjects in that list. So we have basically three lists in our Constitution: Union list, we have a state list, and we have a concurrent list. So this arrangement is just to reduce kind of a legalism which necessarily involves because of the written federal constitutions. And therefore, in our Constitution, these kind of powers to legislate are exclusively stated and determined. But in special circumstances, the Union will have power to legislate, to make laws on all the state subjects. When the state governments are suspended, the Union has a power to make laws. During the emergencies, the Union has a power to make laws on the subjects which fall in the state list. So this is one of the provisions or one of the arrangements in our constitutions which makes it less rigid and less legalistic. Otherwise there would always be a quarrel between the state and the union about the power to make laws on various subjects. So in order to avoid that kind of a quarrel between the state and the union, the lists are available in the Constitution. Not only that, but the second means adopted to avoid rigidity and legalism is the provision for facility with which the Constitution can be amended. So it's very easy to amend the Constitution of India. The provisions of the Constitution relating to the amendment of the Constitution divide the articles of the Constitution into two groups. So all the articles in the Constitution are divided into two groups. In one group are placed articles relating to A. the distribution of legislative powers between the center and the states, B. representation of the states in Parliament, C. powers of the court. All other articles are placed in another group. So when it comes to these three categories in which the Constitution is divided as to how the powers to amend the Constitution will be determined. So in one group are placed articles relating to A. the distribution of legislative powers between the centers and the states. So if there has to be a change in the Constitution about this particular aspect of distribution of legislative powers between the center and the states. So whenever there is going to be a discussion or there is going to be an amendment regarding regarding changing the union, state or concurrent list, the states have to be involved in such kind of an amendment of the Constitution. B. the representation of the states in Parliament. So the Rajya Sabha constitutes the second chamber of the Parliament, and according to the population, various states send very many representatives to Rajya Sabha depending on their population. Such is not the case with America, and because such is not the case with America, the small states in America are at par with the bigger states in America, and it makes the Constitution very undemocratic, because it is not based on the Senate in America, is not based on the representation in terms of the population, but it is based on the state. Every state will send 2 senators in the Senate. And because of that, because of this discrepancy in the Constitution of America, it's very difficult to pass the laws in the Senate. So a lot of progressive laws were stalled in the Senate in the past and even today. But such is not the case in India. But if there has to be a change in the representation from the various states, the states must be taken into consideration. See, the powers of the courts. And this is a very important issue because we have the unitary court system in which the Supreme Court stands at the height of the judicial ladder, and then there are high courts, and then there are local courts. So anything to do with the power of the court, any amendment to do with the power of the court must involve the consent of the states. Now, any other article which are falling outside of these 3 particular subjects can be amended very easily by the union government by a double majority, namely a majority of not less than 2/3 of the members of each house present and voting, and by a majority of total membership of each house. The amendment of these articles does not require ratification by the states. So majority of the articles in the Constitution does not or do not require the ratification by the states. And the 3 categories that I just spelled out need the ratification of the states. One can therefore safely say that the Indian Federation will not suffer from the faults of rigidity and legalism. Its distinguishing feature is that it is a flexible federation. So the federation that we have is a very flexible federation. It is not a rigid federation. It's not a watertight sort of compartmentalization of the states. And its flexibility is due to the fact that the states, there are the 3 kinds of lists. There is also provision to involve the states in the amendment of certain articles of the Constitution of India. There is another special feature of the proposed Indian Federation which distinguishes it from other federations. A federation being a dual polity based on divided authority with separate legislative, executive and judicial powers of each of the 2 polities is bound to produce diversity in laws, in administration and in juridical protection. So if there is a dual polity, there are the state governments and the central government. If there are 2 governments operating, this system is going to produce diversity in laws. So if there are say 31 states and they formulate the laws, there will be very many laws in very many states. Like there is such a case in America. Every state has a different law about registration of the lawyers. So if you are a lawyer in one state, it's very difficult for you to practice in another state. But such is not the case in India. And in administration, it will create a kind of a diversity, and in judicial protection. Up to a certain point, this diversity does not matter. It may be welcomed as being an attempt to accommodate the powers of government to local needs and local circumstances. So this diversity is okay to some extent, because then it accommodates the powers of the government to local needs and local circumstances. But this very diversity, when it goes beyond a certain point, is capable of producing chaos and has produced chaos in many federal states. One has only to imagine 20 different laws if we have 20 states in the union, of marriage, of divorce, of inheritance of property, of family relations, of contract, of torts, of crimes, of weights and measurements, of bills and checks, of banking and commerce, of procedure for obtaining justice, and in the standards and methods of administration. Such a state of affairs not only becomes the state, but becomes intolerable to the citizens who moves from state to state only to find that what is lawful in one state is not lawful in another. The draft constitution has sought to forge means and methods whereby India will have a federation and at the same time will have uniformity in all basic matters which are essential to maintain the unity of the country. The means adopted by the draft constitution are three. A single judiciary. Number two, uniformity in fundamental laws, civil and criminal. And number three, a common all India civil service to man important post. Now in the United States, there is a division between the federal judiciary and the state judiciary, and they are separate and independent of each other. While in India, such is not the case. The high courts are the courts operating under the Supreme Court of India. So though they are located in various states, they are not separate from the Supreme Court. That's a very important distinction. They are not independent of each other. So the care is taken to remove all diversity from laws which are at the basis of civil and corporate life. The great courts of civil and criminal laws such as CPC, IPC, Criminal, the Evidence Act, the Transfer of Property Act and all, they are all common throughout this country. But there are some laws like the public trust laws which are not common to all the states, but they fall under the jurisdiction of the state. And also, like whenever there is kind of a very strict federation, the administration is also very strict. But as far as Indian Federation is concerned, there is a single administrative system wherein the officers are appointed by the central government, but they work for the states, like the Indian Administrative Service and Indian Police Service. So of course these particular aspects of the constitution raised a lot of criticism on the constitution, on the draft constitution, and Dr. Ambedkar said that we are continuing the administration of the past, because we can't suddenly break the past and begin afresh. So he said that we are continuing from the past. And people said that there is nothing new in the draft constitution, that about half of it has been copied from the Government of India Act of 1935. There was a criticism was leveled against the constitution that half of it has been copied from the Government of India Act of 1935, which was formed or came into being after the Simon Commission and the roundtable conferences, as we have seen. That the rest of it has been borrowed from the constitutions of other countries, and that very little of it can claim originality. So these were the criticisms that were leveled against the constitution, that about half of it is a copy from the Government of India Act 1935, and rest of it has been borrowed from the constitutions of other countries, and that very little of it can claim originality. And now Dr. Ambedkar answers this criticism. Now let's read it. One likes to ask whether there can be anything new in a constitution framed at this hour in the history of the world. More than 100 years have rolled over when the first written constitution was drafted. It has been followed by many countries, reducing their constitutions to writing. What the scope of a constitution should be has long been settled. Similarly, what are the fundamentals of a constitution that are recognized all over the world? Given these facts, all constitutions in their main provisions must look similar. The only new thing, if there can be any, in a constitution framed so late in the day is the variations made to remove the faults and to accommodate it to the needs of the country. The charge of producing a blind copy of the constitutions of other countries is based, I am sure, on an adequate study of the draft constitution. I have shown what is new in the draft constitution, and I am sure that those who have studied other constitutions and who are prepared to consider the matter dispassionately will agree that the draft committee, in performing its duty, has not been guilty of such blind and slavish imitation as it is represented to be. So it is not the imitation of the other constitution. It is not certainly the blind imitation or the copy of the other constitution. As to the accusation that the draft constitution has produced a good part of the provisions of the Government of India Act 1935, I make no apologies. There is nothing to be ashamed of in borrowing. It involves no plagiarism. Nobody holds any patent rights in the fundamental ideas of the Constitution. Nobody has a patent over the fundamental ideas of the Constitution. Nobody has a patent over the idea of the liberty or equality or fraternity. No human being can claim that they have been created or invented or discovered by them. Nobody has the patent over these ideas. It's a very important statement. Nobody holds any patent right in the fundamental ideas of a constitution. What I am sorry about is that the provisions taken from the Government of India Act 1935 relate mostly to the details of the administration. I agree that administrative details should have no place in the Constitution. The administrative details should have no place in the Constitution. But the discussion that now follows, the way Dr. Ambedkar expresses very important aspects about the democracy in India, is very crucial to understand. And I am going to go very slowly on this matter. I wish very much that the drafting committee could see its way to avoid their inclusion in the Constitution. But this is to be said on the necessity which justifies their inclusion. Grote, the historian of Greece, has said. Now what Grote has said? The diffusion of constitutional morality not merely among the majority of any community, but throughout the whole, is the indispensable condition of a government, at once free and peaceable. Since even any powerful and obstinate minority may render the working of a free institution impracticable, without being strong enough to conquer ascendancy for themselves. So Grote says that the constitutional morality is to be practiced not just by the majority of any community. It has also to be practiced by the minorities. If such is not the case, then the obstinate minority may render the working of a free institution impracticable. So the constitutional morality, the diffusion of the constitutional morality, is a very necessary condition for the working of a democracy. By constitutional morality, Grote meant. Now let's look at what is meant by the constitutional morality. A paramount reverence for the forms of the Constitution, enforcing obedience to authority acting under and within these forms, it combined with the habit of open speech, of action, subject only to definite legal control and unrestrained censure of those very authorities as to all their public acts, combined to with a perfect confidence in the bosom of every citizen amidst the bitterness of party contest, that the forms of the Constitution will not be less sacred in the eyes of his opponent than in his own. So it's the sacredness of the constitutional morality that Grote is speaking about. Without that kind of a faith in the constitutional institute or the form of the Constitution cannot simply work. And this is what is meant by the constitutional morality. While everybody recognizes the necessity of the diffusion of constitutional morality for the peaceful working of a democratic constitution, there are two things connected with it which are not, unfortunately, generally recognized. Number one, the form of the administration has a close connection with the form of the Constitution. So the administration cannot be opposite to the Constitution. The form of the administration has a close association with the form of the constitution. The other is that it is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of the administration. So if you change the administration, whatever is the constitution, it doesn't matter. You can pervert the constitution. It follows that it is only where people are saturated with constitutional morality, such as the one described by Grote, the historian, that one can take the risk of omitting from the constitution details of administration and leaving it for the legislature to prescribe them. So in whatever society the constitutional morality exists, the administration can be left in the hands of the legislatures. Now such is not the case in India. Therefore, Dr. Ambedkar has raised a very important question. The question is, can we presume such a diffusion of constitutional morality? Can we assume that the constitutional morality is diffused throughout India, diffused throughout the political party, diffused throughout various institutions? Constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated. We must realize that our people have yet to learn it. The Indians have not yet learned it. And this is a very important statement which I am going to read, and you must pay attention to this statement. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil which is essentially undemocratic. So the Indian society is undemocratic, and democracy in India is only a top dressing. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil which is essentially undemocratic. This is a very important comment that Baba Saheb Ambedkar made in this speech. In these circumstances, it is wiser not to trust the legislature to prescribe forms of administration. This is the justification for incorporating them in the Constitution. That's why our Constitution is very bulky. Another criticism that is leveled against the draft Constitution is that no part of it represents the ancient polity of India. Some people raise this criticism. They said that the Constitution does not reflect at all the ancient polity of India. It is said that the new Constitution should have been drafted on the ancient Hindu model of a state, and that instead of incorporating Western theories, the new Constitution should have been raised and built upon village panchayats and district panchayats. There are others who have taken a more extreme view. They do not want any central or provincial governments. They just want India to contain so many village governments. The love of the intellectual Indians for the village community is of course infinite, if not pathetic. Like we have seen these tendencies in India to glorify the villages, but most of the tendencies to glorify the villages comes from the people who live in the urban areas. So there is just a glorification of the villages, that the villages are like the panchayats and the villages are like the republics. And when Dr. Baba Ambedkar said this, the love of the intellectual Indians for the village community is of course infinite, if not pathetic, and there was a huge laughter in the Constituent Assembly. It is largely due to the fulsome praise bestowed upon it by Metcalfe, who described the village communities as little republics having nearly everything that they want within themselves and almost independent of any foreign relations. The existence of these village communities, each one forming a separate little state in itself, has, according to Metcalfe, contributed more than any other cause to the preservation of the people of India through all the revolutions and changes which they have suffered, and is in a high degree conducive to their happiness and to their enjoyment of a great portion of the freedom and independence. No doubt the village communities have lasted where nothing else lasts. But those who take pride in the village communities do not care to consider that what little part they have played in the affairs and the destiny of the country. Very strong argument. And why? Their part in the destiny of the country has been well described by Ambedkar himself, who says, dynasty after dynasty tumbles down, revolution succeeds to revolution. Hindus, Pathans, Mughals, Marathas, Sikhs and Englishmen are all masters in turn, but the village communities remain the same. In times of trouble, they arm and fortify themselves. A hostile army passes through the country. The village communities collect their cattle within their walls and let the enemy pass unprovoked. Such is the part the village communities have played in the history of their country. Knowing this, what pride can one feel in them? They have not contributed anything to the nation making. They are just a small closed groups. So how can one take pride in such a village communities? That is the question Dr. Baba Ambedkar raised, and very rightly. That they have survived through all vicissitudes may be a fact, but mere survival has no value. The question is on what plane they have survived. Surely on a low selfish level, I hold that these village republics have been the ruination of India. I am therefore surprised that those who condemn provincialism and communalism should come forward as a champions of the village. And now this is another very important statement that Dr. Baba Ambedkar made on that very day. What is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism? So in these words, Dr. Baba Ambedkar described the villages. The villages are but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism. I am glad that the draft constitution has discarded the village and adopted the individual as its unit. So the unit of the Indian polity is the individual, every citizen of this country. The third criticism that we are going to look into before we end is the criticism against the safeguards that the Constitution has provided for the minorities. Now this section is very important. In this, the drafting committee has no responsibility. It follows the decision of the Constituent Assembly. Speaking for myself, I have no doubt that the Constituent Assembly has done wisely in providing such safeguards for minorities as it has done. In this country, both the minorities and majorities have followed a wrong path. Minority in this case is the Muslim minority. It is wrong for the majority to deny the existence of minorities. It is equally wrong for the minorities to perpetuate themselves. A solution must be found which will serve a double purpose. It must recognize the existence of the minorities to start with. It must also be such that it will enable majorities and minorities to merge someday into one. So you begin with the recognition and then you do something so that the communities merge in the future. The solution proposed by the Constituent Assembly is to be welcomed because in it a solution which serves the twofold purpose. To diehards who have developed a kind of fanaticism against minority protection, I would like to say two things. Now Baba Sahib says two things about the protection of the minorities. He says, one is that the minorities are an explosive force which, if it erupts, can blow up the whole fabric of the state. If the minority force, if it erupts, it can blow up the whole fabric of the state. The history of Europe bears ample and appalling testimony to this fact. The other is that the minorities in India have agreed to place their existence in the hands of the majority. In the history of negotiations for preventing the partition of Ireland, Redmond said to Carson. Now these were the two major political agents. Ask for any safeguards you like for the Protestant minority, but let us have a united Ireland. So this was a negotiating chip. Redmond said to Carson, ask for any safeguard you like for the Protestant minority, but let us have a united Ireland. Carson's reply was, damn with your safeguards. We don't want to be ruled by you. So Carson replied that we don't want to be ruled by you, and damn with your safeguards. We don't want the safeguards. We don't want to be ruled by you. No minority in India has taken this stand. They have loyally accepted the rule of the majority, which is basically a communal majority and not a political majority. So the majority in India is a communal, Hindu communal majority and not a political majority. It is for the majority to realize its duty not to discriminate against the minority. Whether the minority will continue or will vanish must depend upon this habit of the majority. Now if we look at the problem of Hindu and Muslims, the blame is always on the minority community, but nobody talks about what the majority of the Hindus should do in order to forge the two groups together. And this danger Dr. Ambedkar expressed way back, and the fear has come true. The moment the majority loses the habit of discriminating against the minorities can have no ground to exist, they will vanish. And with this, we come to a very important discussion about very important aspects of our constitution, as to how our constitution is a sort of very flexible federation. It's not a very watertight federalism as is the case with America. The constitution provides a ground to have administration built in the constitution. Is because of the dangers that the constitutional morality has not diffused in the Indian society, and therefore there is a need to spell out the form of administration, because if it is not spelled out, the legislature can undo the constitution, it can pervert the constitution. And we have seen some very important statements by Dr. Ambedkar about the democracy in India. Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic. And then we have seen how Dr. Ambedkar favored individual as the unit of the political system, not the villages, and he has argued against making villages the unit as of the constitution. And he made a very important statement about the villages. What is the village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism. And then Dr. Ambedkar has justified as to how the minorities, their interest should be safeguarded in the future constitution of India.